Elvis had some problems with people close to him. One time, when a doctor named Dr. Nick tried to reduce his medicine, Elvis got angry and accidentally shot him without hurting him. Elvis was also seeing many women while still being with Linda Thompson, trying not to let them know about each other. He had a difficult relationship with the Colonel, who managed his career. The Colonel wanted Elvis to give out fewer scarves to fans because the price went up a bit. Elvis agreed at first, but then asked for more scarves later when the Colonel wasn't around. He found a way to show his disagreement without causing a big fight. When it was time for Elvis to perform in Vegas again, he was not happy. He didn't like being in Vegas and felt like he had to keep going back because of the Colonel and his gambling debts. Lamar Fike remembered Elvis saying, "I'll play this town until I die," but he was upset because he felt the Colonel was using him to pay off his debts. It was thought that the Colonel's casino debts were reduced each time Elvis signed a contract. Larry Geller said he saw the Colonel lose a lot of money gambling in one night. Elvis didn't want to keep going back to Vegas, but he thought he might have to because of the deals they would make. Before going to Vegas, Elvis was with his girlfriend Jo Cathy. She noticed he didn't look well and was having trouble breathing. During the flight, they had to make an emergency landing because of his breathing problems. When the show started, people said he looked tired and his voice wasn't good. He had a lot of health issues, including being bloated, which made it hard for him to breathe. On the second night, he even lay down on stage to sing. Elvis told the Colonel, who was in charge of his career, that he was sick and couldn't perform on the third night. But the Colonel said it was too late to cancel. Elvis performed both shows that night, but he didn't seem very excited about it. The next morning, he went back to Memphis and was admitted to the hospital. The rest of the shows were canceled and rescheduled for later in the year. Elvis had to go to the hospital because of some health problems. He had high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and was very tired. He also had trouble breathing, and his voice might be in danger because of it. Doctors found that his stomach was swollen, making it hard for him to breathe properly. They thought he might have a lung disease called COPD. After checking him more, they found out that he had a big problem with his colon pushing into his chest and a lung disease that runs in his family. But just like sometimes happens today, they thought it was a different lung disease called COPD instead of the family problem. In the 1970s, doctors like Dr. Nick had limited tools to help them understand Elvis's health problems. They found that Elvis had a big liver and fat in his body. They wanted him to go to Johns Hopkins Hospital to learn more about his health issues, but Elvis didn't want to do it. He didn't want people to think he had any weaknesses, especially as the king of rock and roll. Elvis didn't want to show any vulnerability to others. Elvis had a bad problem with his colon his whole life, and it was getting harder to hide. It caused him to have accidents on stage, and the doctors like Dr. Nick and Nurse Tish were trying to help him. They even talked to a surgeon, Dr. John Nash, about it. Elvis heard about a new operation for obesity that might help, but Dr. Nash wasn't there to discuss that. It's possible that a different operation, called a colostomy, was suggested to help Elvis's colon problem, but he didn't want it. The doctors thought it could save his life, but Elvis said no. Dr. Nick thinks Elvis's pride might have stopped him from getting the help he needed in 1975. When Elvis left the hospital, he still had many health issues. A nurse came in the morning and another one, Nurse Marion, came in the evening to help him with his medicine and check his blood pressure. Elvis didn't perform again until December, after his Vegas show was canceled. Jerry Schilling said Elvis was in a lot of pain from his divorce, not being able to make a movie with Barbra Streisand, not being able to tour overseas, and his health problems. But Elvis didn't want to admit he was sick. When his airplane, the Lisa Marie, was ready to fly at the end of the year, it made him feel like a rock star and helped him forget about his health issues for a while. The plane had candy, bubble gum, and Pepsi, but no alcohol. Elvis didn't drink and didn't like others drinking much either. Elvis really liked his airplane and spent a lot of money on it. It cost a lot to buy, fix up, and keep flying each year. The plane used a lot of fuel, and it needed a crew of 4 people to help with flying it. Elvis changed a lot when it came to flying. He used to travel by bus and didn't like flying, but by the 1970s, he had a pilot named Ron Strauss that he trusted. Elvis would talk to the crew before each flight and respected their opinions about flying. He didn't like to fly, but he knew it was necessary for his life, so he listened to the crew about any problems or bad weather. Elvis Presley served as a supporter in the Air Force, flying a lot between California and Vietnam. He respected people who served in the military and didn't like that some young people didn't support the war. If asked if he would have wanted to serve in Vietnam like he did in 1958, he said he would have been eager to help his country. Elvis enjoyed spending time with a pilot named Ron Strauss, and they would share stories. Elvis was very kind to pilots, giving them good seats at his shows and even introducing them by name during a performance. Elvis wanted to buy a big plane because he planned to travel and perform in other countries. He had talked about this idea for a long time, even during the '68 comeback special. He asked his old friends, Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana, if they would join him, and they said yes. When he met his new pilots, he asked if they could fly him and his group to Europe. One of the pilots, Ron Strauss, said yes, as he had experience flying in Europe. Elvis wanted to visit many places, but not Roanoke, Virginia, or Atlanta, Georgia. His friend Red West confirmed this. In 1972, Elvis wanted to perform in different countries like Tokyo, Moscow, Paris, and London using satellite technology. His security team discussed it, but nothing happened. Elvis was offered a lot of money to perform in places like Australia and Japan, but his manager, the Colonel, always said no. Some people think it was because of security issues or that the arenas in other countries were too small for Elvis's huge fan base. In the United States, he performed in arenas with 10,000 to 15,000 seats. But in other countries, there were big venues like Earl's Court Stadium in London with 17,000 seats, Nippon Budokan in Tokyo with 14,471 seats, and Grüge Hall in Germany with 8,000 seats. There were options for Elvis to perform, and he could have done multiple shows to fit more fans. A friend of Elvis, Sonny West, thought that Elvis's behavior was the reason they didn't tour abroad. Elvis liked to have guns and pills with him, and his manager, the Colonel, was worried this could cause problems. Elvis even brought a gun on a plane once and didn't take the bullets out when asked. It seems like they could have tried to convince Elvis to stop these risky behaviors so he could travel overseas, but no one really talked to him about it. It's surprising because offering him a big opportunity like that could have been a good reason for him to take better care of himself. Also, if Elvis had a doctor, Dr. Nick, traveling with them, maybe he could have found a way to bring the medications with them. The Colonel, who helped manage Elvis's career, had a problem with his citizenship. He didn't travel much, even though he knew important people in the government. Some think it's because he had done something illegal in his home country and didn't want to risk getting caught. The Colonel was also not very nice and had some issues with his emotions. Even though he could have easily become a US citizen, he might have been scared or didn't want to do it. Because of this, Elvis never performed in other countries, and both the Colonel and Elvis share some blame for that. Elvis's daughter, Lisa Marie, and the plane she was named after, added more pressure on Elvis to keep performing. He had to pay a lot of money each year for the plane, which was almost $500,000. His dad, Vernon, was worried they would run out of money. Elvis believed that if he trusted in God, they would always have enough. Sometimes, when they were low on money, it would suddenly get better again, and Elvis would give some of it away. In 1975, Elvis had to borrow money from a bank in Memphis. Even though he had made over $100 million in his career, he was having trouble with his money because of his expensive lifestyle and the plane. He used Graceland as collateral and borrowed $350,000, with half of it due in 1976 and the other half in 1977. Sadly, Elvis passed away before he could pay back the second half in 1977. In 1975, Elvis performed in 108 concerts and had a huge show on New Year's Eve with over 62,000 people attending. It was his most successful show ever, earning $800,000. In 1976, he did even more shows, 129 in total. Elvis was the one pushing for more concerts now because he needed the money. He knew he had some health problems like trouble breathing, colon issues, tired adrenal glands, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, painful arthritis, and eye problems. But he had made a lot of expensive purchases and felt he had to keep performing to pay for them. Elvis told his team to get ready for a big tour across the country and suggested they spend time with their families before it started. Elvis knew he needed to keep performing a lot to make money and support all the people who worked for him. Even though some people saw that he was using more prescription drugs when he toured, no one really thought about stopping him. Elvis would feel better when he took breaks, like going on a vacation to Aspen, but he still had to keep working to pay everyone's salaries and his own expenses. He had many concerts and shows throughout the year, and he even worked in places like Tahoe and Las Vegas. The tours started in March and didn't slow down until the end of the year. He had 9 tours in total, plus extra shows. In 1976, many things changed for Elvis. Some people left his team and new younger people joined. Musicians were also thinking about leaving. Elvis and the Colonel signed a new contract about how they would share money from concerts. Before, the Colonel got 2/3 and Elvis got 1/3, but now they would get equal parts. However, the Colonel wanted to wait to change this until Elvis was doing better financially. Elvis also recorded songs at his home, Graceland, for the first time in almost a year. They used a special room called the Den, which had shag carpet on the floor and ceiling. This made it a good place to make a temporary studio. In this room, Elvis recorded a few songs like She Thinks I Still Care and The Last Farewell. Elvis's first tour was only 6 days with 4 cities and 8 shows. People noticed he looked weak by the end in St. Louis. His second tour was even busier, with 7 cities and 8 shows in just 7 days. Elvis was tired and had breathing problems. His drummer, Ronnie Tutt, had to hit the drums harder to get Elvis's attention. Cousin Billy Smith said Elvis was so tired that even small things would exhaust him. They had to give him medicine to help, but they had to be careful not to make him too sleepy or affect his performance. Elvis had a health problem called adrenal insufficiency/fatigue, which made it hard for him to perform and be energetic. He needed medicine to feel better, but taking too much made it difficult for him to be Elvis too. He didn't understand this and thought more medicine would help him recover faster. People like Nurse Tish and background singer Kathy Westmoreland noticed his drug use and how sick he was in the 70s. When Lamar Fike told Elvis to stop taking the drugs, Elvis said he needed them. Lamar thought Elvis was like a drug addict. The truth was, Elvis had many serious health issues, and because of them, he became dependent on prescription medication. Most people only saw one problem, either his health or his medication use, and Elvis didn't want them to know about both because he didn't want to seem weak. He was a strong and powerful person known as the boss. Dr. Nick had 2 plans for giving Elvis medicine, one for when he was on tour and one for when he was at home. These plans worked okay, but sometimes Elvis got extra medicine from other doctors. Elvis had trouble sleeping without medicine and needed to rest his body and brain. His doctor, Dr. Nick, tried different medicines to help him sleep. These were strong medicines like methaqualone, Valium, Valmid, Placidil, and Vicodin. They were good for insomnia and anxiety but could be addictive. Over time, Elvis needed more of these medicines because his body got used to them. Sometimes, he had trouble speaking the next day because the medicines weren't completely out of his system yet. But most of the time, he could still function well in his daily life. People sometimes said he was a drug addict, but that wasn't true all the time. Elvis had health problems in 9 out of the 11 main systems in his body. His heart, lungs, and digestive system needed medicine. He had trouble sleeping, which is part of the nervous system. His adrenal glands and testosterone levels were issues for the endocrine system. His immune system wasn't strong. His urinary system didn't work properly. There was even a time when he might have needed dialysis because of kidney problems. His arthritis caused a lot of pain and affected his muscles and bones. Sonny West said that Elvis's drug addiction was because of his poor health. In his last year, it's true that he became addicted to prescription medication. But even before that, more than 80% of Elvis's body systems were not working properly. Out of 9 systems that were in trouble, 5 of them, heart, breathing, digestion, nerves, and immune system, had problems since he was born or before he started using drugs because of fame. In the end, it's hard to say if Elvis died because of the drugs he was taking, the health problems he had, or the constant traveling and performing that made everything worse. Dr. Nick, who was also a friend, had a tough job trying to manage Elvis's medications. If he didn't give Elvis what he wanted, Elvis would find another doctor. This made things complicated, and even some other doctors were giving Elvis drugs without knowing what he was already taking. It was a sad and messy situation, and people who cared about Elvis were worried and heartbroken. In 1976, people noticed that Elvis didn't look or sound as good as he used to during his shows. He seemed tired and confused, but sometimes he would still give a great performance. Photographer Keith Alverson took many pictures of Elvis at his concerts from 1971 to 1977. He noticed that if Elvis's hands looked normal, he would give a lively and focused performance. But if his hands were swollen, his performance would be less energetic. This pattern made Keith think that Elvis's hands might be a sign of how well he would do on stage. In 1976, Larry Geller, a hairdresser, joined Elvis's group of friends again, and even the Colonel, who was in charge of Elvis, didn't mind at this time. The Colonel wanted Elvis to stop exploring different religions in the 1960s, but he didn't care if it made Elvis happy and helped him perform. Larry noticed that Elvis was having trouble breathing, even when he was sitting down. Elvis would often need to take deep breaths after talking just a few sentences. Doctors found out he had a breathing problem called COPD, probably alpha-1, and a condition called megacolon, which made it hard for him to breathe and caused him to need voice injections before his shows. During a performance in Tahoe, Elvis used an oxygen tank to help him breathe between songs. Elvis was starting to lose control of his voice, which was very important to him. During Elvis's tours, making sure his blood pressure was okay was very hard. His blood pressure was high, and people were worried about him having a heart attack. Even when he said he was tired during a show, he still had to finish it. After the show, they had to work on lowering his blood pressure again. Dr. Nick said that Elvis's blood pressure would go up to 170 to 200 systolic and 90 to 110 diastolic when he was stressed. At home, it would be normal, but being on the road was tough on him. Elvis was also worried about possible lawsuits because of his shows. Sometimes his friends got too rough with fans, and this led to problems. One time, his dad Vernon fired 3 of his friends, Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, because they didn't listen to warnings. They were all upset, especially Dave, who joined later but felt the same. It was thought that Elvis wanted to teach them a lesson and then hire them back later. But instead, these 3 friends decided to write a book about Elvis's private life and drug use, saying they wanted to help him. This made Elvis very worried for a long time. Elvis had a complicated friendship with Dr. Nick. Dr. Nick found it hard to say no to Elvis and liked being friends with such a famous person. They had some problems, like a failed business partnership and a loan Elvis gave Dr. Nick. Because of their issues, Dr. Nick didn't go on tour with Elvis in 1976. Instead, Dr. Gainham and Nurse Tish went, but people were worried about Dr. Gainham giving Elvis too many drugs. After the first show, people called Dr. Nick and the tour manager, Colonel Parker, about Elvis's medical treatment. They needed Dr. Nick to come back on tour because things weren't going well. If he didn't come back, they might have to stop the tours altogether. Dr. Nick joined a tour and found out that Dr. Gainham gave Elvis some medicines that caused problems. One drug, Spirine, made Elvis's blood pressure drop and caused issues with his shows. Another drug, Donatol, affected his speech and movement when taken close to showtime. Dr. Nick's job was to balance the medicines so they helped more than they hurt. Even though he crossed the line between being a doctor and a friend, and gave the same drugs to Elvis's friends, he was the only one trying to control the situation. Other doctors also gave Elvis addictive medicines, but Dr. Nick's efforts lessened the harm. People like Marty Lacker and Joe Esposito think Dr. Nick was the better option among the doctors because he tried to control the situation.